We just wanted to quickly let you know before we get started that this episode does contain mentions of suicide. If that's something that you don't really want to listen to, then this episode might not be for you. Or if you check the description box, we're going to put the time codes that you might want to skip over. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
My name's Caitlin Bishop, and I'm the Campaigns Coordinator at Privacy International.
My name's Josie Tum, and I'm an Advocacy Officer at Privacy International.
I'm so excited that this week we're going to be taking a deep dive into the issues around rights and privacy for the global disability community in the digital age. This is an issue that at PI we've been dying to get into for a number of years. And I was wondering, Josie, if you can just highlight to the listeners as to why we're here now and why we think it's important to be doing work on this.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Gus. At PI, we have a strategic area focused on human dignity. And as part of this, we work on a project focusing on social and economic justice around the world. And this entails looking at the human rights of people who face some of the most marginalization in our societies. And so as part of this work, we've been looking at welfare schemes and benefits. And we discovered that in some cases, people are being subjected to really intrusive surveillance practices as they're trying to access this critical state support. There are an estimated 1 billion people around the world with disabilities. And since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen more and more social welfare, social protection systems coming into being, and more of these are digitized, meaning that there is big impacts on people who have disabilities. And so this is part of the reason that we chose to put more work into and expand our activities looking at the rights of people with disabilities and how these are impacted by technology.
And if you're interested, I think, listener, in some of the history of our work on that kind of broader social welfare area, you can listen to a podcast we did a few years ago called, I think, When Big Brother Plays Your Benefits. I will look it up and put it in the description box. But that is kind of a bit more UK specific than what we're going to talk about today, but does dive into some of that really pernicious surveillance that people who engage with the welfare system, who receive benefits of various kinds, have been facing for, a huge number of years. I mean, yeah.
So I imagine, and I look forward to you taking us through this, and we even have some guests with us today, which is really exciting. I imagine that the injustices are just exponential. I'm using I have a math background. I really shouldn't use terms like exponential unless they really are exponential. But there's the existing injustice of welfare programs and how they're administered. They tend to be designed against the very people they're there to help. But on top of that, for people with disabilities, the technology and the systems are not designed for them either. And so it must be an incredibly frustrating process. I was wondering if you could describe to us the path for this edition of the podcast.
So today we're going to unpack some of these really big issues and look at the main concerns when it comes to the rights of people with disabilities and the right to privacy, as well as some of the priorities and challenges around this work. We're going to talk about how these rights are impacted by technology and chat about some specific technologies like artificial intelligence, automated decision-making, and about what can be done to protect these rights and uphold these rights, including the role of different actors like governments, policymakers, such as the United Nations, and also civil society and private companies too.
So Josie and I had the huge privilege of talking to our three guests. First up is Marc, based in Canada, who's the CEO of the World Blind Union. We got to talk a whole lot about the tension between sometimes privacy and accessibility, the role of technology, the use of AI in social welfare systems, the kind of local versus international approach, all sorts of things that were absolutely fascinating. Then hop, skip and a jump to Australia, where we got to talk to Rosemary, who's the Vice Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and is the Australian Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission, who again was absolutely fascinating and had some really interesting things to say about the outsized impacts of these digitizations, these technologies on people with disabilities, in the ways that they can become kind of isolated from society and the ways that they can be really disempowered in disproportionate ways. And then last but by no means least at all, we've got the privilege of talking to Heba, who's the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and has been looking into AI and other things in her upcoming report, which is coming out soon. So yeah, let's dive straight into that conversation with Marc.
My name is Marc Workman. I'm the CEO of the World Blind Union, and I am based in Canada.
Thanks, Marc. Could you tell us a little bit about the World Blind Union, please, and what you do?
Yeah, the World Blind Union is an organization made up of other organizations. So rather than having individual people as our members, we have organizations, and we have a very large and diverse membership. Some organizations having, more than 1,000 employees, and other organizations being entirely volunteer run. And these organizations are spread right around the entire world. We have, in and around a couple of hundred organizations that are members of the World Blind Union. We work on two main areas, one being advocacy, where we are participating in different conversations, largely at the international level with various UN agencies, trying to ensure that the issues that blind people face are taken into consideration at that level. And the second area would be around capacity building, where we're trying to make sure that our members around the world have tools and resources that they can use in their own national and local advocacy efforts. This is our 40th anniversary year, so we've been around for 40 years as the World Blind Union.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Marc. Obviously, today we're here to talk about the rights of people with disabilities, specifically in the digital world. But I thought we could begin just very broadly by if you could say something about what we mean when we're discussing the rights of persons with disabilities.
In a lot of ways, I would say the rights of persons with disabilities are not different in and of themselves than the rights of people without disabilities. The difference is we may require other types of steps or, accommodations to ensure that our rights as people with disabilities are realized. So examples might be right to education, right? A right to an education is a right for people with and without disabilities, but for those who have disabilities, in order to actually realize that right to an education, you may need to take steps to ensure that accessibility is in the education system, that there are no discriminatory practices in the education system. And the same would be true of other rights like the right to political participation, or for women to have a right to sexual and reproductive health. Those rights, in order to realize them, are going to require some additional steps, such as making sure that the information is accessible to someone with a disability. But them rights in and of themselves are not really distinct. It's more a matter of articulating in, say, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's a matter of articulating how we can go about realizing these widely accepted human rights.
That's a great explanation. Thank you so much. And with a view to realizing these human rights, that's why we're here today, because digitization and the introduction of digital technologies is becoming more and more common. We're seeing, tech kind of proliferate everywhere into our daily lives and becoming critical to access these rights, Marc, that you're talking about, and many of our basic needs. And so it's a little bit of a changing landscape, and it can be changing very rapidly. And so I wonder if you could just hone in a little bit more on what this landscape looks like the human rights landscape for persons with disabilities, and maybe some of the main priorities or challenges that you see at the moment?
For people with disabilities, at least at the international level, the kind of North Star when it comes to recognition of rights would be the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, commonly known as the CRPD. And so this is a convention that the disability community uses to try to ensure that our rights are respected around the world. And so there's a lot of work that our organization, the World Blind Union, does to ensure that member states are actually implementing the convention and ensuring that our rights are realized in those countries. But we also try to support our local members to use the CRPD. So running webinars to make sure they're aware of the CRPD and the difference it can make in their local community, and just trying to generally ensure that individuals and organizations around the world are using this really important tool to guarantee their rights in their own countries. But we also definitely try to make use of other international treaties like the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. These are other, you might call more mainstream treaties where people with disabilities can also be impacted. So, of course, there are children with disabilities, and so the Convention on the Rights of the Child could come into play for children with disabilities. There are women with disabilities, and so treaties recognizing rights of women would come into play there. And so we do try to make use of all international law to support our advocacy efforts. But like I say, the CRPD is sort of the one that most directly articulates how to ensure that the rights of persons with disabilities are realized. And so that's kind of at the international level. At the national level, there would be various forms of legislation, human rights legislation, constitutional guarantees in some cases. In Canada, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that recognizes the rights of persons with disabilities in the actual charter. And so those can also be very useful documents and tools for advocating for recognition of rights at the national level. When it comes to priorities, I think in some cases there are overlapping areas of concern, across the disability community. So one that has been very important in recent years and will continue to be important is around climate action and disaster risk reduction. And then there may be others that might be somewhat more specific to different types of disabilities. So in the blindness community, the right to read is of grave concern for us, the right to be able to access information that is presented visually. But in the deaf community, a right to sign language would be a high priority and a top concern. In the case of people with developmental disabilities, it might be the right to an inclusive education that is really motivating and driving a lot of the work.
It's interesting to hear all the different tools that you use, both at national and also international level. It just makes me think that a legal instrument like this Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, many of these were drafted a number of decades ago, and of course the world has changed quite a lot since then, and technology has also ramped up, and we're seeing it more and more. And I think what do you see as being the role of technology in this effort to ensure the rights of persons with disabilities around the world are respected and realized?
What we have found when it comes to technology, and I think this has been a long-standing view within the blindness community for sure, and I think the broader disability community, is that technology is a sort of double-edged sword, which means it can, on the one hand, improve the situation for people with disabilities. It can remove existing barriers, but it can also create new barriers. And so I'll just give a couple of examples. So when it comes to removing barriers, one technology that the blind community has relied on for decades now is OCR, or optical character recognition. And this tool, this technology, allows a blind person to take a printed document and convert it into something that's readable by a blind person, whether that's through a Braille display or through a technology on the computer that turns the text into speech and makes it accessible to a blind person. And, way back in the 70s and 80s when this technology was first invented, it would have been the size of a washing machine, this technology. And now every, smartphone would easily be able to perform OCR on various pieces of text. So there's a really good example of a technology that removed is maybe a strong way of putting it, but certainly reduced that barrier for blind people. And so that's been a very positive technology. But I mentioned there can also technologies, when we change things, when we quote unquote improve technology, we can introduce new barriers. And one of the kind of most obvious day-to-day examples that blind people run into would be around appliances. So I mentioned a washing machine, as that was the size of the first optical character recognition machines. Washing machines themselves have become technologically more advanced, but also have created additional barriers. So there was a time when a washing machine or a dishwasher or a stove, an oven, were all operated using actual tactile buttons and knobs and things that you would turn and you could feel them. And to make those machines accessible didn't require a ton of effort. It might be a matter of putting a small tactile indicator to know, which is the temperature that you want for your oven, which is the rinse cycle that you want for your washing machine. So there was ways of making them relatively accessible to blind people. Of course, now a lot of these appliances are using touch screens and have complex menus. And so we've seen them become less accessible as the technology has improved, in quotation marks. I think there are ways, and we're seeing ways that further advances are actually reversing that trend a little bit. So we're seeing people be able to use their smartphones to be able to operate their appliances. And so that can now allow you, using your phone, to be able to access those different menus and settings within your various appliances, which is great. But of course, not everyone has a smartphone. So, we always advocate for universal design, trying to ensure that they are accessible from the outset, that those manufacturers and designers are thinking about how is this product going to be used by various people with various abilities. But overall, we do find benefits from technology, but we're also for sure seeing barriers that can be created when technology changes and when we see these new technologies being introduced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even in the instances where technologies are accessible and are playing a role that can facilitate persons with disabilities to access their rights, we've seen that there can be this tension, right, between accessibility and privacy sometimes, because it can be the case that in order to access, for example, a public service, you're required to give up quite a lot of personal data, and some of that data can be really sensitive. For example, data that's related to your health or data that's related to a disability is actually seen as a especially sensitive category of personal data. And so, of course, privacy should never be sacrificed for the sake of accessibility, and actually persons with disabilities should be able to enjoy both of these to their full extent. What do you think, Marc, about this tension, and where, if anywhere, have you seen it in your work?
I think there is a tension that can arise when it comes to accessibility and privacy. And you've pointed to one area, which is having to disclose a lot of personal information in order to receive a service or to be able to access a government program. And so our advocacy is often around universal design. In an ideal world, things, products, services, programs would all be designed such that they're not specially tailored for people with disabilities. They are simply designed for the entire population to be able to access them. And so we push for a universal design with the hope that you won't, as a person with disability, need to disclose information, or, at a maximum, you might just self-identify as a person with disability without having to provide detailed medical records just in order to be able to access various programs and services. So that's the goal. That's the hope, is that you design things in such a way that they are accessible to everyone. There may be times where that's not possible. An example that I sometimes give is an accessible parking space. There are just physical limitations to be able to make an accessible parking space. Not every parking space in and around a business can be equally accessible, right? Some are closer to the entrance, and that's what makes them more accessible. And so there are some cases, I think, where in order to ensure that those who truly need those spaces are able to use them, we might need to have some types of disclosures or some types of criteria that we use to make sure that people with disabilities are able to access these things. For sure, that is sometimes the case, but to the extent that we can, we always want to push for universal design and accessibility without having to disclose a lot of personal, private information. That's one, I think, interesting tension between accessibility and privacy. Another, though, is where you can see examples where in order to make something more accessible, it might be necessary to relax some privacy restrictions. And so an example in this case might be around voting. In Canada, at least, you would not be able to use certain technologies, or previously you were not able to use certain technologies like a camera in order to facilitate your ability to vote independently. And that might be related to the right to a secret ballot, which is in some cases thought of as a right to a secret ballot. In some cases, it's thought of as a responsibility that you should not share who you've selected when you're voting privately. But tools like a camera and a phone, a smartphone, can make it so that a person who's blind can actually independently fill out a ballot, or can call someone they trust to help them fill out a ballot. And sometimes those tools are not permitted for people with disabilities. And those might be related to privacy, why those tools are not permitted, even though they can enhance accessibility. I'll just give one other example of an area where accessibility and privacy might be in tension. Things like smart glasses that are worn, throughout the day. There are legitimate reasons why glasses could be seen as increasing surveillance or violations of privacy, and those need to be considered and dealt with appropriately. At the same time, smart glasses can reduce barriers for those who are blind by things like facial recognition, so that you can identify people more easily. It might allow you to access information in the environment that's only presented visually. And so there's a tool that, if it's entirely restricted due to privacy considerations, could end up reducing some of the accessibility that blind people find very beneficial. So I think there's interesting tensions. I don't think one needs to fully win out over the other. We need to try to balance these things. We need to try to maximize both privacy and accessibility because people with disabilities also are concerned about surveillance and privacy. So we want to make sure we're taking both into consideration.
Of course, technologies, and particularly automated technologies, automated decision-making processes, and artificial intelligence are being, as you know, more and more introduced into these state welfare systems in order to often choose who can be eligible to access them. Particularly following the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a big escalation in the rollout of these systems, of these digitized social welfare systems. And of course, the rights of persons with disabilities are heavily implicated in these. And there are concerns about discrimination, there are concerns about surveillance, and we've seen this in the case of the UK specifically. But I'd be interested to hear your perspective, Marc, on the rights of persons with disabilities within these systems and their ability to access those benefits that they need.
I'm glad you brought up AI, artificial intelligence, as it is for sure a technology within the blindness and the wider disability community that has a lot of potential for good and a lot of potential for harm. On the good side, this technology can be used to remove barriers that exist. Examples might be being able to identify or describe images to blind people. It's sort of like takes optical character recognition and converting text, printed text, into something accessible. It takes that to the next level and expands it beyond text to any sort of visual depiction of information. So things like charts and graphs can be made more accessible to a blind person through AI. And so we're really excited about the technology, but also cautious about some of the potential harms of the technology. So you mentioned one is using it in making decisions about social welfare. And our concern within the disability community is largely around bias that might creep into the modeling of AI. We know that AI is trained on human inputs. And unfortunately, we also know that humans discriminate against people with disabilities. There are negative attitudes that creep in when it comes to persons with disabilities. And so the fear is that leaving the decision-making up to an AI that has been trained on human inputs has resulted in a situation where the AI has integrated some of those discriminatory attitudes into the decision-making of the AI. So that's a major concern. And what's interesting about social welfare is one of the reasons those programs are really crucial is because the employment market, employment opportunities are limited for people with disabilities. We know that the employment rate is significantly lower for people with disabilities, and it relates to another area where AI is being used and has a lot of potential for harm, and that's in the sort of human resources side of organizations. So using AI to screen out resumes would be one example, but I've also heard of situations where AI might be used to actually conduct interviews in a sense, right? You might be using a camera and AI might make observations or suggestions based on a person's body language and their ability to make eye contact with a camera. And of course, the way that people with disabilities look and our bodies move may be different than the norm. And so you could have a scenario where recommendations from the AI are being made that, again, introduce bias and discrimination against people with disabilities, which only makes it harder for people with disabilities to find employment, which makes us more dependent on those social welfare systems. So it's a very important area that we are, within the World Blind Union, very concerned with and watching. Like I say, there are lots of opportunities and we're excited and we want to make sure that the technology is accessible and is solving the problems. But we also want to do our best to ensure that we're not creating new barriers with this technology.
Marc, I just wanted to ask, with the technological and particularly the private company stuff that you're talking about, have you seen technology, and particularly accessible technology, creating new divides between people with disabilities who are, particularly poor or struggling with income, and people with disabilities who maybe are better off and can afford more of those technologies, particularly, as you said, because people with disabilities tend to be overrepresented and underemployed in those kind of more marginalized communities?
We are definitely seeing situations where the disparate access to technologies is having an impact. Within the World Blind Union, we have members in various countries throughout the entire world. And certainly, I notice on a day-to-day basis that certain members are not able to connect to things like webinars that we might be offering or participate in meetings. And it's largely due to a lack of access to the internet. And this just creates challenges. It means you're less connected. It might affect your employment opportunities in that you may not be able to take on certain roles that are international, located outside the country because your internet compromises your ability to do your job and to attend meetings and that sort of thing. So that's certainly one example. If we look at specific technology products, the iPhone is a product that has been around and accessible since 2009. And through a lot of hard work within the disability community, it's become a very useful tool, but it's also a very expensive tool relative to other smartphone options. I've talked to many blind people who would prefer to have an iPhone. They might find it more accessible or find that it has more applications that are useful, but are required to purchase a smartphone that's more affordable, even though it may not be as accessible or may not be as useful for that individual. So definitely a divide, and I think it can have wider implications on the ability of people in developing countries or people within developed countries that are just at lower income levels, that they are not able to connect as well and not able to participate in the employment space as easily. And the concern is that this will be worsened over time, that as certain people get further and further ahead and certain people fall further and further behind because of technology, that this is a sort of self-perpetuating problem. And so that we need to do our best to ensure that beneficial technology is equally available among all people with disabilities throughout the world.
So Marc, I was going to move on to speak a little bit about kind of the scale of advocacy work to push further for the realization of these rights, be it on an international or a local level. And I'd be interested to hear how you think it's best to approach advocating for some of these things that you've been talking about. If you think a kind of a multi-pronged or multi-scale approach is important, or if you see some kind of intervention or level of work, be it domestic, be it international, as being more needed right now?
It's a really good question. And for the World Blind Union, we are an organization that believes strongly in localization, which is a term that is used pretty frequently. But for us, what that means is we sort of recognize that as people with disabilities, we live in local communities. That's where we do our daily activities, like going to the grocery store and meeting with friends and just living our lives happen in the local community. And so, we want there to be international frameworks and laws that can help set policies when it comes to accessibility, but it all has to be implemented at the local level. So it is really a multi-pronged approach. You have the international policy, the national policy that can set out requirements and obligations for governments, for the private sector, but all of that needs to be implemented at the local level. And that's where it's really important to have strong organizations of people with disabilities at the local level, which is one of the reasons why capacity building is one of the key areas of work for World Blind Union. We recognize that our members are the ones that are going to be working with local entities to implement these big international frameworks. And we want to do as much as we can to provide resources and tools and information that they can use at that local level to make sure that these really lofty international documents, treaties, frameworks are actually having a benefit to the people living on the ground.
I'm Rosemary Kayess. I'm the Vice Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I'm also the Australian Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission.
Thank you, Rosemary. And could you just tell us a little bit about the Committee on the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and what that does?
The committee is established under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is an international treaty negotiated at the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it's been ratified. So 191 countries have agreed to be bound to the objects and purpose and the obligations contained within the convention. So it's a human rights instrument that articulates the human rights of people with disabilities. The reason we have this instrument is because many of the general application human rights instruments, so the ones many people know of, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, weren't having an impact on the very sometimes unique and specific human rights violations that people with disabilities experience. And so people with disabilities kept being represented within, the poorest of the poor and people experiencing high levels of human rights violations. So the Convention articulates all human rights and fundamental freedoms that are found in those three instruments of general application, the UDHR and ICCPR and ICHESCA, and translates them to the specific issues that confront people with disabilities as human rights violations.
Thank you, Rosemary. And maybe could you say something about your own experience in this landscape and what are some of the main priorities or challenges that you're seeing at the moment when it comes to human rights for persons with disabilities around the world today?
People with disabilities experience a wide variety. I mean, they're not a homogenous group. So you can't sort of identify core areas of rights where you say these are the ones that are the biggest priority for people with disabilities. But there are areas of egregious human rights violations, and that's the level of segregation of people with disability. So there's still lots of institutional-based residential care arrangements for people with disabilities. So lots of people with disabilities still live in institutions. And that could be large, very large facilities of congregate care, but it could also be much more common in other societies where it's smaller, what people are calling group homes. But it's still accommodation where you don't get to live where and with whom you choose.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Rosemary, it's an estimated 1 billion people around the world have a disability. So there's clearly enormous diversity within that group of people. And I think maybe that can lead us on to talking about the digital space within this context, because we're seeing a seismic increase in digitization around the world, in everyday life, of course. And so, everybody, including persons with disabilities, are needing to interact with digital technologies, with data-driven practices more and more often. And I think it would be interesting to hear from you about the appearance of technology in this landscape and the importance, the role maybe of technology when it comes to the rights of people with disabilities.
Yeah, well, the human rights framework recognises the rights of everybody to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. I mean, that's recognised within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it's also articulated within Article 15 on the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And it requires the recognition of the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. So for the CRPD, whilst it doesn't repeat Article 15 from the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, it recognises technology as a facilitator of the realisation of human rights. And so technology and access to technology is quite a significant focus within the general obligations and the overarching obligation of accessibility within the Convention. And so this is about supporting the realisation of other rights, such as the right to live independently and be included in the community, and the right to freedom of expression and opinion, and access to information. But it also supports the right to employment, education, health, and equality before the law, because as you say, technology is increasingly involved in all of those aspects of our society.
Often people are required, to give up large amounts of personal data in order to access particularly public services. And that personal data, when it comes to data related to a disability, can be really sensitive. And so what do you think about preserving the right to privacy of persons with disabilities in the digital space?
It's critical. And I mean, the CRPD and human rights speaks to the right to privacy quite strongly, but not many people are aware of how technology has such data extraction mechanisms. And not only are they not aware of the data extracted, it's how that data is going to be used more broadly. So if privacy laws aren't kept up to date, and I mean, my country here, Australia, is a classic example of that. Our privacy laws are decades old. So to make it operable in today's technological environment is very, very difficult. So privacy laws need to keep pace with technological developments.
Totally. And I think that's a key challenge when it comes to states upholding the rights of persons with disabilities, maybe in some of their policies. You just mentioned the example of Australia, but I know that also within the committee, Rosemary, you recently looked at the UK as an example too. And I wonder if that's something that you might want to speak about a little bit more.
Well, the UK was speaking strongly about how it was going to use AI to link data to be able to identify, fraud and misuse and assessment of people's payments. And we had a very similar thing here in Australia. And the experience was that it started with the premise that fraud was happening, and it captured people that were not acting in fraudulent ways. And we had significant trauma through the disability community of people that were being treated like criminals and being chased by debt collectors, all based on these algorithms. And there were reports of a couple of suicides. So in terms of the inquiry, I was really interested in asking Britain about how they intended to approach this and how they were going to make sure that they didn't go down the path of Australia and put in place something that was based on faulty algorithms, and knowingly based on faulty algorithms too, sadly, were the findings of the inquiry.
That's true. I think in January 2024, the UK Department for Work and Pensions came before Parliament after a legal challenge was made by an organisation of persons with disabilities. And they actually said, Rosemary, as you say, that the algorithms do have biases in, which is pretty shocking, right? I mean, what did they say to you?
They didn't respond to that particular question, which was kind of damning in itself. They did respond at one point by saying that there would be human intervention and that it wouldn't be all machine learning. But regardless of whether there's human intervention, if it's still based on faulty algorithms, how's the human intervention going to identify that if they weren't involved in the development of the algorithm in the first place? So you're putting a lot of emphasis on the protections downstream when it should have been at the beginning with the algorithms.
Absolutely. Yeah. So these algorithms, I mean, they are contributing towards making decisions that have, enormous impacts on people's lives, right? Whether or not they are able to access critical benefits. I'm just looking right now at the quote from the DWP when they came before Parliament, and they said, The issue is not whether they are biased, referring to the algorithms, because you have to have bias to catch fraudsters. So I think that contributes to this really corrosive narrative, that you raised, Rosemary, about benefit fraudsters that has long been debunked by persons with disabilities, including academics, but which retains traction, both in the public sphere and in policy as well.
It's not like the UK's DWP is famed for their supportive and non-biased, friendly approach to the disability community. It seems to me the algorithm issues are built on the existing, deeply concerning and cruel UK benefit system. I mean, how often have you seen algorithms exacerbate existing problems versus create new ones? Because it seems mostly they're exacerbating existing problems.
Well, when you start building an algorithm that's looking for fraud, your central premise is that there is fraud to start with. So you're building the concept that people with disabilities are defrauding the system from the word go. So it's not surprising that the outcome is that there's people defrauding the system.
Absolutely. And, these discriminatory impacts of automated decision-making have been widely and repeatedly reported, and due partly to bias or non-representative data sets where people with disabilities are not included or thought of in the conception or the development of these systems. And I suppose, Rosemary, another problem is that automated decision-making systems, particularly in the benefits or social welfare space, they operate in a black box manner, right? So this raises a really big issue of transparency and accountability when wrong decisions are made, harmful decisions are made.
All this was happening within the rhetoric. I think when I made my opening statement to the UK delegation was that, yet we find a pervasive framework and rhetoric that devalues disabled people and undermines their human dignity. Reforms within social welfare benefits are premised on a notion that disabled people are undeserving and skiving off and defrauding the system. This has resulted in hate speech and hostility towards disabled people. What measures do you intend to take to counteract this? How are you ensuring that systems you are putting in place to monitor fraud and errors do not contain AI tools and algorithms that contain encoded biases, resulting in cruel mechanisms that, in essence, traumatize and make people feel like criminals? So basically, it was not just that there were unconscious bias or there were biases in the algorithms, there was also a pervasive political rhetoric. People with disability are viewed quite negatively anyway within society. And so if you overlay that with a political rhetoric that they're either just skiving off or trying to defraud the system, it reinforces that stigma and has a significant impact.
100%. And it is rhetoric, but it also becomes real policies and practices, right, that have tangible and sometimes devastating impacts on so many people's lives. And when it comes to the UK Department for Work and Pensions, before your inquiry, Rosemary, PI did some research into the DWP and its surveillance practices of people with disabilities, because you have to give up so much personal data, often a lot of it which is really sensitive to actually access some of these benefits in the first place. And then what we found was that even after this, people were still being subjected to really intrusive surveillance practices that actually departmental guidelines explicitly endorsed physical surveillance of people, to huge detriment to their fundamental human rights to privacy. And also that this departmental guidance actually contributed towards this really dangerous and demonizing narrative of persons with disabilities as benefit fraudsters that you were just talking about, and that it was actually an objective of the department in this guidance to get as much media coverage as possible and to work with the media of, so-called incidents of fraud. And I think this shows why your inquiry is so important in terms of exposing the dangers of this kind of narrative and policy. Rosemary, maybe tell us a little bit about the Robodebt case, or why is it important?
I mean, Robodebt is the colloquial term, but it was basically a system by where the Department of Social Services here in Australia were monitoring people's payments, and they were deeming whether people had been overpaid or not. And so people were getting their pensions cut and being put into debt receivership with private debt companies that would then harass people for payment for a debt that they didn't have.
I mean, it sounds stupid, but part of the reason it's called Robodebt is because people were being harassed by automated calls, right? They were receiving functionally a call from a robot saying you owe a ton of money.
To start off with, but then it was, physical debt collectors coming after them.
Which, as a process, is so involved. So you get a call from a robot. You can't argue with a robot. It's a robot. It just tells you owe a ton of money you don't owe. And then as you're struggling with that, suddenly you get a knock on the door saying, oh, well, you owe a ton of money. And also now I'm here and I'm a debt collector and I'm not the easiest to negotiate with either, particularly if you're vulnerable, particularly if you're stressed under a lot of pressure. And it did lead to suicides and all sorts of completely horrendous outcomes.
And traumatised, re-traumatised and re-traumatised quite vulnerable people that were made vulnerable because of the nature of, their disability, because they're limited access to resources and limited resources to rely upon to be able to argue their case. And so they were made vulnerable by that inequality and discrimination they experienced. And so it was very hard for them to say, well, no, I have not defrauded anybody. I am not in debt.
And we'll add some links into the description for everything we've been talking about, but including on the Robodebt. It was completely agonising and horrendous for the people that were experiencing it.
Yeah, and I mean, that comes on top of the fact that lots of the research and the data that goes into lots of technology developments, especially algorithms, is based on a very ableist norm to start with. You put other prejudices on top of that. And
I wonder if we could just touch very briefly on the role also of private companies who are more and more now involved in the provision of public services or products and state support and or assistive technologies or devices and social benefits. And I wondered if you had any comment on the role of private companies.
Well, we did hear some evidence during the UK follow-up review about a private company that was doing assessments for work capability. And what was being said was that there was actually an algorithm that they had that said for every extra page of questions that they add to the assessment process, so many people will drop off and not complete the assessment. I haven't been able to verify that, but it came from more than one person. Whether it's true or not, it raises the question that algorithms have that capability of being able to be used in that way. And so if private companies have got a contract that is about minimising the number of people on social welfare, then what mechanisms are there to protect them from using mechanisms such as that? There needs to be a level of transparency where you can be confident that private enterprise is working in the community's interests, not in its own private interests, when it's undertaking a community welfare role.
Yeah, and this is something that PI has raised as well when we've made representations to UN bodies talking about exactly this point. And, what we've said is that when governments are drawing up agreements, contracts with private companies like this, or what's known as public-private partnerships, there really needs to be specific safeguards in there when it comes to regulating data processing and safeguarding fundamental human rights, but with specific reference to the rights of persons with disabilities as well, to ensure that, anything done by this company is transparent enough, respects data protection principles. How do you think the role of these companies can be, either regulated or made safe, I suppose?
It becomes very difficult. I'm sure this happens in the UK as well, that contracts are seen as commercial in confidence and that the provisions within contracts can't be released even under FOI because they're commercial in confidence, and that the private sector needs to be confident if it's going to work with governments that that sort of information isn't going to be subject to FOIs. So, but then how do you get the insurances that people's privacy and the principles that should be upheld by, say, a public service undertaking the role, which is far more transparent? So how do you ensure that transparency?
I mean, one of the safeguards that PI has asked for pretty consistently in any contract that governments have with private companies is that private companies should be required to waive commercial confidentiality, though with potentially more safeguards where they can make reasonable defense of why it needs to be commercially confidential. So like the specifics of kind of the internal workings of something, in which case they should nonetheless be required to release it to an independent, smaller group of people who can properly review it. Obviously, companies are not keen on that as a safeguard, but government contracts are so, there's so much money that it seems like if governments don't have the leverage to request and include those kinds of terms in those contracts for delivering public services on which the public rely and on which frequently governments are legally obliged to deliver, then, I mean, there's no hope for anyone else because those contracts are so large.
Yeah, and I mean, it raises the question that if there's such large contracts that should significantly increase the need for transparency. I find it difficult to justify commercial in confidence when it has the potential to lead to human rights breaches, and it's acting in the government's stead.
I mean, what do you see as kind of a way forward in order to achieve some of this transparency, or, not only for private companies also, but to hold states accountable or make sure that the states, when rolling out these policies are ensuring that the rights of persons with disabilities are going to be respected rather than, trampled upon?
I think it's very difficult. I think it will take court proceedings. I think more things like the Robodebt and the European Court of Human Rights cases being taken forward in those jurisdictions to be able to have pressure brought to bear on states to act and to put in place mechanisms to ensure the privacy and ethical undertakings of government contracts.
And what do you see as the role of UN mechanisms in achieving this?
Well, I suppose it's a bit like the UK inquiry. It's about being able to expose. I mean, whilst the UN processes struggle to get governments to act even under the binding instruments, what we can do is we can support civil society in highlighting the issues and articulating where there has been human rights violations and help to bring pressure to bear domestically on governments to change. And I mean, it can reinforce the standard of human dignity to be applied in terms of equality and non-discrimination for people with disability. And, you can't say many of the actions of the UK inquiry findings met the standard of human dignity. There were cases of suicide. Many people lost their benefits. Many people were left living in unsafe situations. Many people had to go back to social care and congregate living situations.
I think also, Rosemary, that highlights, the kind of fundamental role of people who have lived experience of some of these egregious rights violations, who've been at the forefront of sounding the alarm and bringing some of these concerns to UN mechanisms and, working to expose.
It's incumbent upon research to be inclusive and bring people with lived experience into the research to ensure that the data that goes into technological developments reflects the diversity of the human condition, that algorithms capture disability in a positive human rights way, because otherwise it's the old programming adage of garbage in, garbage out, and people with disabilities will be left out. I mean, the new technological age, what are they calling it? Are we up to the 5th industrial revolution now? These technological advancements can either break the social isolation and exclusion that is experienced by people with disabilities, or it can entrench it. It can entrench it in ways that completely isolate people with disabilities from mechanisms by which the society operates. We are moving much more into a digital world. And unless the current barriers are addressed, we're just going to keep reinforcing those barriers into new technology, and it will just further isolate people with disabilities. And it was the British academic Michael Oliver that first looked at disability from a materialist perspective and coined the concept that disability really emerged with the Industrial Revolution. That as we moved out of agrarian lifestyles and industry became the norm, you needed standardised workers to work in factories to do repetitive, similar tasks. So they had to have a standard set of skills, and anybody outside those standard skill sets was not relevant and so excluded from the modes of production for the Marxists in the room. And so the 4th and 5th industrial revolution has the same potential. If people with disability don't have access to technology and the applications of technology, then once again they'll be socially isolated and economically excluded.
My name is Heba Hagrass. I am the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I've been appointed in November last year, and it's nice to meet you and talk about technology and privacy issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's brilliant to have you on the podcast, Heba. And just for those of us who are not very familiar with the UN system, could you please explain what your role is?
One of the first things is that we have to engage with communications with states, with persons with disabilities individually and in their NGOs, DPOs, all the forms that is possible everywhere globally. And this communication goes through our system to really make us feel what's happening on the ground. This is the first major part of the duties of the mandate holder. The second part is that we are supposed to be visiting a number of countries that we choose according to a certain plan and according to a geographical distribution, so that we really see how can we help the countries that did not join the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, how they can join or how they are performing with the convention, and if they need any help, visiting a country with our expertise. We look at the country, analyze what's going on. We have good models about how to practice certain things and about how to solve the problems. And through these visits and through meeting with the state people and meeting with NGOs and individual persons with disabilities, we write a report that we send to the government and we send to the whole country. And then it is published so that people can really benefit from what we have recommended for the country to improve its implementation of the convention, which is really benefit not only the country, but benefits the whole area. Because usually in certain geographical location, you can see that there is a trend in how people behave or a cultural facet to an issue. So when you are really being able to analyze this and pinpoint how things can be solved, this improves the situation for the country and also the neighboring countries. The third duty of the mandate holder is that we present thematic reports, and these thematic reports are actually usually ahead of what is usually being done, because the special rapporteur and the team is supposed to really have a further way to look at things and suggest, maybe we will have a problem here, and we suggest that we face it earlier on and we do this and that. And one of these things is, for example, one of my thematic reports that I intend to work on is AI and its effect on persons with disabilities, which is your area. And here, from my side, I'm trying to say, come on, AI is coming and it's working very fast and it's going to intervene in everything and get into everything, including privacy, definitely. And how can we deal with AI as an asset and as an advantage for persons with disability, and not as a new Himalaya mountain that it's going to block and make a lot of barriers and obstacles for people with disabilities. And this is one of the thematic reports. There are a number of interesting thematic reports I'm planning to present.
Thank you, Heba. That brings us on a little bit to technology, which is obviously affecting the human rights landscape that you're working on. And can you say something about what you have observed as being the impact of technology?
I remember when we have just started having computers and internet. And the start of internet, actually people with disabilities were very hopeful that, we are going to work with computers, we are going to be on high speed, and we will reach many things that we would love to have reached through hard copies and ordinary books. And what happened is that with the revolution of computers and internet, we started facing a real Mount Everest in front of us, because people who had problems accessing visually or hearing impaired, accessing the computers and going and surfing the internet was a real disastrous experience. We couldn't access, we couldn't reach, although the world is speeding up. Then persons with disability really felt, we are going to be trapped. We are going to be really damaged by having this technology, until software starting having text to speech, speech to text, and start having now sign language interpretation on web pages and all this. And all of a sudden, all the gates opened for persons with disabilities, and they really start running and getting as much as they want and they like through the computer and through the internet. Wealth of information, wealth of data, wealth of whatever you can imagine. It was the most important revolution for persons with disabilities. Every time it increases, it gives us more opportunity to further reach and further having the capability of being on equal footing, receiving the information and producing it like everyone else. This was the situation up till now, until AI came and we start feeling again the dilemma Are we going to jump into the future with AI, or again, we will have this incredible barrier? And are we going to really be included or not? And this is why we are flagging it out now that we need people to put us at the forefront when they are considering the different categories of people that they will be dealing with AI. The persons with disabilities need their accessible tools to access AI and work on it and work with it so that they can reach and be able to be equally dealing with the AI like any other person who doesn't have a disability. Either we will go into the future or we are going to go to the Stone Age.
Thanks for highlighting, Heba, these concerns when it comes to technology and particularly AI, artificial intelligence. This is something that we've been worried about at Privacy International as well. There are concerns about things like encoded biases in the algorithms of some of these systems that might have the potential to actually discriminate against persons with disabilities. Maybe they're not trained on representative data sets. And, if these are not used correctly, that they could risk perpetuating discrimination or excluding persons with disabilities, And we've been seeing this in some examples when it comes to public services of social welfare, digital social welfare, for example, in the UK as one example, but elsewhere also in Serbia and in the USA. So I'd just be interested to hear more from your perspective about your feelings on the use of AI and maybe some of the main issues that you are looking at.
Josie, just you mentioning these negative aspects, it means that we have identified the problems. The minute you have identified the problem means that this is the minute we are going to work on solving it. We have solved more difficult problems. Yes, these are the negative byproducts, but if you are thinking about us and you are thinking about including us, you have identified it and people will work on it. All these armies of technologists and people that are working in different aspects in everything now, every minute detail has really an army working to solve its problems. I am not worried. I just want to pinpoint where the negative aspects, and we have excellent teams that are really, whenever they will spot the problem, they will solve it. Definitely it will be solved. Our problems with communicating with machines, our problems with privacies that we should have, and the leaks that we should not have about our personal lives and personal data, all this, once it is mentioned, it means that it has been pinpointed, and hopefully we will work on it. We have to say why there is this problem and how it is affecting us. And if we are asked for help to how to solve it, I think if we have any idea how to solve it, we will be the first to participate and take part saying how can this problem be solved.
And how do you think people with disabilities can and should be better included by governments as they are, introducing AI processes more and more into public services?
Definitely, I believe it's always through the ministry that is concerned about persons with disabilities, which are the Ministry of Social Solidarity or whatever the name is in different countries, and through the National Council for Disability Affairs, and through their DPOs, OPDs, NGOs of development. All of these are channels and open channels for persons with disabilities to express what they want and what do they need. And at the top, it is very important that the ministries insist about the participation of persons with disabilities individually and through their organizations to say what are their problems and how they perceive it solved, even if we say it in a naive way. But if you are an engineer, you will know how to translate it into your work, to translate it into the proper action engineering-wise.
When it comes to data protection and the rights of people with disabilities, of course, be it when accessing or using assistive technologies or accessing a public service, even when it comes to voting or applying for benefits, for example. Often we're having to give up a lot of personal data, and some of this data can be, sometimes very sensitive, such as biometric data or data related to our health. And I know that this is something that's reflected in the International Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Article 31 that discusses the processing of data or data collection. And I just wondered what issues you've come across when it comes to data collection in your work or in your country visits on the rights of people with disabilities.
It is very important for us to collect data because persons with disabilities have not been visible for a very long time. And we need to really, so that we can really help them properly, we have to know every minute detail. We have to know where they are and how they are and the causes of the disabilities and how can we reach them with services and how many things. The more we have data, the more we have segregated data, the more we can help, the more we can have models, the more we can transfer these models to other places, the more we can go faster in serving people. All these details are data. And this is how we should handle things. And it is one of the major problems in disability is not having enough data. But the negative side is how will this data be used? Actually, this level of information is there about persons without disabilities. Everything about a person without disability is very well known to the minutest details. So we are going to do the same for persons with disabilities. And the protection will be for everybody. It is not specially for persons with disabilities. You yourself, you need to protect your data. If you have anything that should not be known or only known to a specific institution to help you and to really modify your services or whatever, this should be dealt with like everybody else. Privacy is something that goes for everyone, but maybe because we are collecting more data now, everybody's worried, what are we going to do about this data, especially that it could be negatively analyzed. Meaning, for example, we know that Heba is a person with disability, so we will not take her as an employee in our company. This is what we are worried about. But actually, the ways that you are protecting privacy for other persons, it is the same that should be done for Heba. And it's very easy if we are dealing with the main core of the convention on equal footing with others. So the privacy needed for you is exactly the same privacy needed for me. And it is legislation and laws that will protect everybody, not only persons with disabilities.
And that brings me on very nicely just to the last thing that I wanted to ask you, Heba. You speak about the importance of legislations and laws and the protection of these human rights. And it will be good to hear what you see as being the role of the UN in ensuring these rights can be upheld around the world, providing oversight or encouraging the development or the implementation of proper laws and legislation as well to uphold these rights.
Actually, one of these ways is our thematic reports that we write from our side and from other special rapporteur sides or working groups or other experts and other organizations and organizations of women, organizations of persons with disabilities. All these are producing a wealth of information, and they are pinpointing the advantages, they are pinpointing the disadvantages, and if anything happens, there is a bell that rings, an alarm that starts, and everything is very clear now. So through these different reporting and through this different researching, everything is exposed. And part of these reports are made by people like us to the UN, which are really put into very good critical examination so that we can get out some resolutions. And because of these reports, drawing attention to the advantages and disadvantages, that the UN automatically starts identifying the major areas that needs to be improve it and how to bridge the gaps and how to manage and go through in a way that is safe for everybody.
Thank you so much to Marc and Rosemary and Heba. Those were really fascinating conversations. The one thing we did want to go into a bit more detail about before we kind of had a chat about the broader conversations and the work that PI is doing is the Robodebt scandal. So to be entirely honest with you, this is something I'd seen happen a few years ago. I thought it had kind of ended. That was not the case. In fact, day of recording today, there was an article 2 days ago in The Guardian in the UK that said that people who'd been affected by the Robodebt scandal felt embarrassed that they had ever expected to receive justice because of what had happened to them. So fair to say, not over. So I quickly want to explain what it is. So in Australia, if you kind of earn too much, your income goes over a certain amount, but you receive social benefits that you would no longer be entitled to, kind of once your income's hit that threshold, you have to pay the overpayments back. It's not an uncommon system. The UK is struggling with a similar system at the moment. We've had a kind of our own scandal around it that you might have heard about. But yeah, in Australia, they have this system. It's supposed to be based on what you got paid within the fortnight up to when you received the benefit. And it used to be kind of a technological system that had a human review element. And the government said, oh, the human review element, like the system isn't keeping up with what we believe to be the scale of kind of overpayments. And that's where they introduced this technological system. Now, the technological system was like an automated data matching system. It looked at the income tax and data that they had and the social welfare data, and then they averaged the income data evenly across the year. So if you received X amount over 2 weeks, they would presume that kind of you were receiving it across the year. They divided it up evenly, allocated it on a fortnightly basis over a financial year to see if you were entitled to these benefits. Now, problem one, that is not compliant with the social welfare framework in Australia. That is not how it's supposed to be done. Lots of people have very variable incomes. If you're picking up kind of 0 hours contract style kind of shifts, or if you're picking up contract work or freelance work, then you have a very variable income. The system is supposed to, according to the social welfare framework in Australia, use the actual income that you received in the actual fortnight before the welfare payment. It is not supposed to be an average across the year. That's not how it's supposed to work. So that's problem number one. The system is inherently trying to do something which it's not allowed to do. Then problem number two, there is no human review. It's entirely robots. It's using data that, you know, the woman who later whistle blew on the system said was wildly corrupted. It wasn't adequate or accurate data for them to be using to begin with. So with no human review, lots of people received automated notices that they owed the government a debt. That they didn't. Like, to be entirely clear, this is money they absolutely did not owe. These were overpayments that either didn't exist or weren't anywhere near as large as they were being told that they were. The system was stupid from the beginning. It was rolled out, like, it had a small pilot program in 2015, it was rolled out wider in 2016, and then in 2017, they expanded it to old age and disability pensions. Now, staff who were involved in the original pilot program said that this is bad in 2015. That's before it got rolled out wider the first time. The Labour Party, who were in the opposition at the time, said this is nonsense in 2016. Nonetheless, it was expanded to elderly people and people with disabilities in 2017 and wasn't officially shut down until 2020. More than 500,000 Australians were affected by the policy and received nonsense notices that they owed a debt they just quite simply didn't. Debt that was followed up in an extremely aggressive and extremely unfair manner. A number of people never received a notification that there'd been an overpayment at all because they were sent to the wrong addresses. That's supposed to be the first contact that you get, which meant the first time they learned about the debt was when they got contacted by debt collectors. The official Royal Commission report, which is the big kind of interrogation of the process, the policy, how it happened in Australia, came out relatively recently and said it was a crude and cruel mechanism, neither fair nor legal, and it made many people feel like criminals. It's a 990-page report. There was a lot that they did incredibly wrong. I mean, incredibly wrong. At one point, victims around 2016, 2017 started coming forward and saying, this is nonsense, I don't owe this, I don't understand what's happening, I'm being pursued by debt collectors for a debt that doesn't exist. And the government decided in their infinite wisdom to release victims' details to the media in a bid to deter them from speaking out and to pursue an extremely aggressive media strategy against people being prosecuted for debt. And people were prosecuted. 2 people were jailed, one of whom was still in prison up to 2023. In 2023, by the October then, prosecutors withdrawn prosecutions against 34 people. There are probably other unsafe prosecutions that, I couldn't find details about. They recovered, you can't see I'm doing air quotes, a total of 746 million Australian dollars from 381,000 individuals that they later had to refund. There was a class action claim from welfare recipients, and if you were one of them and you hadn't heard about this class action, I don't know if you can still claim money, but look into it. And the government had to write off debts totaling 1.75 billion Australian dollars. Nonetheless, 12 officials, including a department head, who breached the Public Service Code of Conduct in Australia 97 times because of their involvement in this, are going to face no repercussions so far because they don't work for the public service anymore. So there are no sanctions that are being pursued against them. The more I read about this, and I'd already heard about it, I already knew it was like horrendous. I already knew that it was a really bad time. The angrier that I got, the more rage I experienced. The consequences of people who were pursued in this way were horrific. Many people were traumatized. Some people went to prison. Some people lost their lives. The consequences for officials absolutely did not match the severity and the disgusting cruelty of the system. And so we just wanted to go into a bit more detail about, what it was, how bad it was, and the fact that it is absolutely not finished yet, and that it's a system that made it, as long as it made it, I think is a real indicator of how badly people understand technology and how cruel people are willing to be to people who rely on social benefits. The presumption was that people were grafting, people were scrounging, people were taking payments that they weren't owed, when that absolutely was not the case. And yes, I am extraordinarily furious. And yes, we might do an episode with a lot more detail because there is more detail, which is crazy.
990 pages of detail.
Yes, 990 pages. And the story isn't done. Like, I just cannot even imagine. Like, this guy called Marc Workman, I'm going to link a load of stuff in the description about this, who said that he was embarrassed to have believed justice would be done, was wrongly informed he was owed a debt of 3,197 Australian dollars, which is a lot of money. Particularly, it's a lot of money if you don't have a lot of money. It's a lot of money if you've got, if you're doing fairly well, but it's a huge amount of money if you don't have a lot. And that wasn't the largest amount that people got told that they were owed. And it's so bad, but I think it really exemplifies how pernicious and horrific these systems can be. The problem was not particularly the staff who administered the welfare system, many of whom blew the whistle, many of whom said the system was wrong, but there was no human review in the system. It said, well, there's an algorithm, and God knows we love an algorithm, but it's when the rubber hits the road of people and flattens them that you really kind of see how poor that reasoning is, and it sucks because people died. I mean, it took 5 years to shut it down. That it made it past a pilot scheme is nuts. That it made it past a pilot scheme and then got expanded is damning.
You're nailing so many of the dynamics around these large technical systems that political systems become enamored with, and it becomes impossible to query the technology, to query the enthusiasm, and to actually identify where it necessarily fails. And that's the thing at PI. We love tech. We spend most of our time playing around with new toys and wanting to get new toys and implementing the latest updates and whatnot. It's just we also know where and how they break. But once technology touches a political system, enthusiasm just takes over, particularly if that enthusiasm and that deployment of that tech can so-called save money. And then the logic of politics overrides everything. And that's what kills me. And that's what's so disappointing about technology in this sphere. It could bring such empowerment to people's lives. It could enable people to achieve things that they haven't been able to because of disability. And yet, when we see technology widely deployed in this sphere, it seems it's almost designed to punish rather than to help.
This is the thing I think that we saw in the previous episode that we did, Big Brother Pays You Benefits, which is that the commitment of people to minimizing the amount they have to pay out in social benefit system far outstrips the sense or the cost of the systems they'll put in place to minimize that amount. Like the amount of money that the Australian government had to pay back to people, the amount of money that the system cost, the amount of money that they had to pay in compensation, vastly will dwarf any amount of money that people were paid above their entitlement.
But how many politicians got to speak for years about how they're going after scroungers, how they're going after the unworthy poor, the unworthy welfare recipients. And this is the sickness of our political system when it comes to these types of systems that are supposed to be designed to help people. They're supposed to be designed to accidentally include people because it should be unthinkable. It should be unfathomable to target people wrongly, to exclude people wrongly, to discriminate against people. But instead, a different logic takes root, and it's just gross.
And it's specifically around decision-making because, Marc, Rosemary, Heba, they were all saying there are great things that technology is currently doing and has the capacity to do for people with disabilities in terms of inclusion, in terms of accessibility, in terms of, a huge number of things. But I don't think at any point did anyone say that where technology is the only factor in a decision, particularly of this magnitude, is that a good plan? I'm waving my hands around a lot. It's a podcast. It's not a visual medium. I'm speechless.
How about you, Josie? What's your takeaway from this? And I will narrate any hand motions that you do, so you don't have to interrupt your flow.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, obviously, at many levels. And this is something that Rosemary was saying about even being a kind of a representative of a United Nations mechanism, even being within the United Nations kind of human rights framework. For them, it's very limited what they can do. And, I think there's a lot of hope because we can see, people like Rosemary, Heba, Marc, and all of those other organizations of rights of persons with disabilities and individual people kind of pushing to move this needle forward and sound the alarm. And that's really important. At the same time, as Rosemary kind of suggested, she sees that some of this might have to go to court, before lasting change can really be seen within these systems. They do have very entrenched problems, as we've just been discussing. And part of the way in going about remedying or dismantling or undoing some of those more corrosive aspects of these systems, as you said, Gus, should really be helping people, is exposing the sickness within them, exposing the problems and where they are broken and where they are causing harm. And I guess that's why it's so important to have this kind of conversation.
I also think one of the things I took from it is we really need to take more joy in the variety of human experiences that exist. Because I think one of the things that I think Marc said that was really interesting was he's CEO for the World Blind Union, and so he focuses on blind people, unsurprisingly. And the accessibility requirements of a blind person interacting with or engaging with education are quite different from the accessibility requirements of, for example, a deaf person or, someone with cerebral palsy or any number of kind of different varieties. And we have I think maybe an understandable tendency to reach for what fits most people because it's the easiest if you can just do one thing. But I think if we appreciated more, if we took more joy in the variety of human experiences that exist, then needing to accommodate for those variety of human experiences we would lead with that more. That might be a bit happy clappy, I don't know, but
what are you talking about? It's not happy. That's exactly how you're supposed to design systems. You're supposed to design them with the thought of, who is this not going to work for? And then can we make sure it works for them? Rather than this ridiculous idea that we design systems for, quote unquote, the fingers up in the air, normal people. We should always be imagining who this is going to hurt and then make sure we're not doing that. And I think a complete sea change in attitude to development of systems is required. The catch is, within the area of welfare, again, they are not politically designed to help people. They're politically designed, often, sadly, to exclude people. And it is because we think that people are undeserving of our kindness and our support, and our society doesn't need them, which is, okay, I'm going to stop there because I'm going to turn into a ranty Caitlin as well. But I want to have the optimism that technology and tech systems can make the world a better place for everybody. It's just, we are so stuck in the mud of every time some bright politician or policymaker said, hey, I got an idea. This seems kind of hard. Let's throw tech at it. My God, Donald Trump's talking about even throwing Elon Musk at the whole apparatus of the state. You know, can you imagine? Can you imagine? It's that. It's exactly that. It's that logic.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, as executive director of PI, I think it's worth me asking, particularly Josie, with all this that we've discussed, with all the interesting aspects to these systems and all the challenges for people's lives, can you try to say to the listeners here, what are we doing about it, other than inviting fascinating people onto the podcast and hearing their perspectives? What is PI going to do about this?
So at PI, we are working on our global advocacy to bring these problems to the attention of people around the world, at the United Nations, in governments. And actually, just a week after making these recordings, we did go to the United Nations and made a statement about it. We're working to shed light on some of these issues where not enough attention is being given to the right to privacy, in particular, of people with disabilities. And so some of this work is global advocacy, is working alongside people like Heba, like Marc, and like Rosemary. And some of it is research as well, to understand what is actually going wrong in these systems around the world and where, and what can be done to change it. So please keep an eye on future podcast episodes and on our mailer to follow that work.
So on that wonderful note, thank you for listening. And remember, you can sign up to be the first to learn more about our work at pvcy.org/podsignup. And as Caitlin and Josie promised, we'll include some links to relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening, or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music courtesy of Sepia. This podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International.